All right, guys, good morning. Holy cow, packed house in here today. Good times. All right. So we got about halfway through chapter 20. This last bit basically goes through and focuses on the different types of biomes. And we'll provide some images of some examples of these as we progress through. So we do want to think a little bit about some of these potentials that the respective habitats might hold. I mentioned last time, we kind of saw a little bit last time, and it's a pretty good image right here where we look at the equator and we can see areas that have lots of green tropical forests. And we've got in this area near or at the equator, we've got a tremendous amount of solar energy that bombards the planet. Basically 12 hours of sunlight, 365 days a year, always providing ample amounts of energy for the environment, in turn for the producers and numerous consumers to tap into those resources. So there's lots of diversity in these types of habitats, and we will see some of that as we progress through. As we look at some of the other possibilities, we can kind of think a little bit about that as well. Areas maybe like tundra types of regions, and again, we'll see some images of these in a second. The amount of solar energy that this area receives is very small compared to that of the equator. It should make sense that there's going to be huge variations when we think about the types of stuff that could live there, the types of plants we might be seeing. You don't think about gigantic trees growing up here in these tundra-like regions. And so what it has to support is definitely different than here, all right? And, you know, kind of across the board, we will see some of these variations. There are also possibilities when we think about some of this that we will see some overlap. And in areas like Idaho, we can see a handful of different possibilities, right? The boreal forests, these are pine trees, conifers, and dependent upon where you travel, we can find ourselves right up in pine tree forests without needing to go too far, right? We also see other things that are, you know, Southern California, we see some chaparral. There's sort of similarities with this as we start showing the pictures. I'm going to move off of this and start talking about it in a little more detail. But we can see definitely some potentials. Desert right up within where we're at as well. We think of Idaho, most of Idaho, as a semi-arid desert. There are other potentials as well. We can look around here in southeastern Idaho and see rather desert-like conditions. We see lots of sagebrush, probably. And dependent upon some of those circumstances, that's kind of like the chaparral types of habitat. It's a little bit different, right? Because of it being a little more dry. But shrub-like growth, definitely, right? And a lot of the area around here, numerous ecology lectures, I hear this area described as a sagebrush steppe, where we see that predominating. So we will see more details as we progress along, right? And again, as we move through here, the thoughts are to kind of just look at the potentials, right? It's basically lots of images that just show vegetation or lack thereof as we kind of move through. So I hit on this as we started. As we are near equatorial regions, we would expect to see higher levels of diversity. And that's really what we're looking at right here. All sorts of variation. And in some of these habitats, the potentials for countless species of things like trees are huge. When we think about here, although there's lots of trees that we have transplanted, that we have put here. If we look at it, if we bump out and look at just in the wilds, we don't see massive variation with the types of trees. We think about a handful of types of pine trees. We think about some deciduous trees like aspens as some of the main things that you might see if you head outside, away from the city, right? But as we look here, there are all sorts of different types. And that in turn sets the stage for other organisms to call these places home and in turn to extract resources from those types of habitats. So savannas dominated by grasses, small woodlands kind of depends. This sort of savanna-like, I would suppose, all right, lots of grasses. And it also depends on where we are at. We're not zoomed in super close, but in areas where we have lots of tropical forests, looking at the understory is very different than when we think about areas like savannas with lots of grasses. There are definitely differences, and we're going to come back and think a little bit about that as well, and differences with potentials for nutrients that the soil might be holding or potentially not, all right? So in desert-like regions, and we showed last time a couple of images of some different deserts, and this is a similar idea. So there are a lot of variations that we can see. It also depends on where you're at, but a lot of the plants, more cactus-like types of succulents, and a lot of these have protective mechanisms like thorns potentially all over them to deter things from coming in and trying to feed on them or to tap into the water reserves that they store. So a lot of this is really thinking the arid environment, helping to prevent and minimize some of that. There's typically some pretty thick wax-like coatings on the surface of these as well. That also helps to minimize some water loss. We talked, oh, so long ago, it seems. It's crazy to think the end is so near. We talked a little bit about photosynthesis. And how plants are able to harness the energy. And we briefly mentioned that not all plants photosynthesize the same way. The end goal is the same, trying to produce sugars so that they can use that as foodstuffs, but how they go about doing it can be a little bit different. And if you recall, the plants have pores on them, on their leaves or on the cactus itself, which doesn't really look leaf-like, but all of the green on here is photosynthetic. It's like a gigantic leaf. It's like really stem-like, but really leaf, all right? Full of chloroplasts, all right? There are stomata, the mouths, that allow for gas exchange. And with not just cactus, lots of the plants that we would see growing in a desert environment are going to be pretty similar. They grow by keeping their stomata closed in the daytime. Other plants around here, their stomata are open in the daytime. Gas exchange is happening while the photo parts of photosynthesis are occurring. We're pulling in carbon dioxide to build sugars. Desert plants pull in the carbon dioxide at night. Their stomata open up as the sun goes down, as the temperatures drop, and the likelihood of losing massive amounts of water are dramatically minimized by doing it when the sun's not beating down on you, all right? So these plants photosynthesize a bit differently. They pull in CO2 at night. They go through the synthesis reactions in the day when the sun's shining on them. but it makes it so that it minimizes water loss. It slows their growth a bit. Some of these gigantic cactus can take years, maybe a century to get full grown, all right? So it truly kind of depends on some of these details. And there are different strategies that we can see being employed to help things persist, right? To help survive in these pretty inhospitable environments, right? I would think, right? And then with that said, although we're really only looking at vegetation, there are animals that can be tapping into these resources, or like I said, potentially being deterred from that. There are definitely some images where, like the giant saguaro cactus, we can see like birds that have burrowed in, kind of like a woodpecker would do to a tree, to carve out a little house within there. And it helps them to get a little bit of, break from the hot desert sun by having a nest inside of this cactus. It scars over and prevents, all of the moisture from being lost in there, but it provides a nice, cool little home for birds. And you can oftentimes see a handful of houses built in some of those big cactus. So this, a chaparral, as we showed in that map, Southern California's got quite a bit of this. This to me looks like some of the hillsides around here. It looks pretty similar, right? Vegetation like this is pretty common. More shrub-like growth is really, when we think about these types of habitat, more of the common vegetation that you see. There are some trees, right? But it's a lot of this, right? And as I was saying, we kind of think of the sagebrush in a similar sort of situation in a more arid type of habitat. These areas, and let me flip it back to this map real quick, where we see chaparral, like Southern California. As we look over here and we're thinking some Mediterranean regions, all of these areas, and over here, there's some other bits as well. But these areas are big issues because as we see this, back to my picture, these are areas that people want to live. Southern California has a very dense population all around the Mediterranean. There are massive amounts of human encroachment into these types of habitats. Chaparral type environments are very threatened, and they're threatened by our own type of encroachment or movement into these habitats because they're pretty nice. Climate is nice, and in turn, that sets the stage for issues for sure and disturbances within there. So here's bison or buffalo. There were once mass quantities of buffalo across the prairies, and that's really what we're kind of looking at right here is some of the prairie savanna-like, sort of, right? More grasses, less, considerably less trees and shrubs in these situations. And through our encroachment into these habitats and other issues, populations of bison have plummeted, and the prairie land, most of it, in the center of the United States has been converted into farmland, cornfields, as far as you can see, and other stuff too. Not that Idaho isn't full of fields either, right? But it's definitely a different situation. In a temperate forest, most of what we think about are deciduous trees, leafy trees, right? Trees that typically drop their leaves as we move into the fall and are barren in the winter months and then re-leafing in the spring. If we flip down to equatorial regions, that doesn't happen, right? They don't lose their leaves. They stay leafy green all year round, right? But as you move away we see variation and fluctuations with this, right? Seasonality has a big impact. And we can also see as we look at this, lots of leaf litter and a lot of vegetation on the forest floor. That provides lots of nutrients, right? As we think about things like those decomposers, they help to break down these nutrients. They help to release and degrade all of the leaf litter so that the roots from these plants can tap back into it and use those nutrients for growth, right? When we think about a tropical situation, and we kind of showed that a little bit, but I'll talk about it right here real quick. Lots of times you don't see a lot of this. You see soil, but not a lot of little grasses and other vegetation. You also don't see huge quantities of leaf litter hitting the tropical forest floor. And the issue with that, or the reason, maybe it's not an issue, is a very high turnover. We decompose these things very rapidly. Temperatures are nice and warm. There's ample amounts of moisture, and that sets the stage for decomposition to happen really, really rapidly, right? The nutrients get recycled quickly, and then turn in a tropical situation where we see vegetation all over the place. Lots of thoughts might be, look at all of this land and the potential to grow all sorts of things. As we start thinking agriculture, the idea might be there's countless, resources within the soil that would let anything we want to grow the ability to grow. And that's not true, right? Ultimately, with that rapid turnover, the soils aren't holding huge amounts of nutrients. They're quickly recycled. And so when areas like tropical forests get clear cut for agriculture, for growing crops, or for raising cattle, either way, we see those soils quickly being lost, basically losing all of their nutrients without adding mass quantities of fertilizers. There are huge issues, right? And issues because of the rapid turnover of this, right? So in these situations, we typically see a scenario where area is cleared away of trees, of the vegetation, so that farmland can be planted. They grow crops there for a couple of years. They deplete it of nutrients and they clear more land. And they keep clearing and planting. And what's left in the wake is areas that are basically barren. It sets the stage for, with a tropical rainforest, for massive erosion, mudslides, runoff, and further depletion of nutrients, right? Numerous things that are problems in these situations. Growing things in habitats like tropical conditions are possible, but you have to think about the mechanisms at work to truly make things function properly, right? There are, I can't remember what it's called, soils in the Amazon where they basically, charred wood, they burnt stuff. It's biochar is what we talk about today with this stuff. And basically taking charcoal and using it maybe in between the rows of plants were initial thoughts with it, so it's not super muddy and they're able to walk on it, but it holds nutrients and it serves as a substance that takes it in and slow releases it out, time released capsules of nutrients. And this stuff gets compounded year after year, holding more nutrients. And we see areas where ancient agriculture actually was very effective in dealing with that. And we think today in other areas about similar potentials and utilizing some of that. And there's other thoughts of stuff like carbon sequestration as we use biochar and take, waste from the field and put it back into the soil a little bit differently than just tilling it under. Kind of interesting. there was a grad student that gave a seminar just a couple of weeks ago talking about biochar and some of these potentials with different types of foodstuffs and their possibilities of holding more or less nutrients and sequestering carbon. Pretty impressive. Okay, so here we could see some conifers, this boreal forest, low-lying plants, and massive amounts of pine trees, all right? And with that said, there is definitely some diversity with them as well as far as the types. They truly dominate in some of these types of habitat. We can see in the background some mountain ranges, nice snow-covered peaks back here. There are areas, as we start looking at mountainous regions, where you can see lots of vegetation, you can see lots of pine trees growing, and then you potentially look farther up on the mountain and there's not, right? Oftentimes you might see some barren rock, and part of the question might be, well, it's barren rock, that's why nothing's growing there. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. It could be that the elevation, it's too high up, too cold, too harsh, all sorts of things set the stage. And they call this kind of line where we stop seeing growth, they call it an alpine ecotone. The alpine region, trees grow below it, but not above it, right? And you can think, even around here, there are areas like that. If we think around Jackson and Grand Tetons and Alpine, Wyoming, where there are trees all over, and then you get higher up in elevation and the Grand Tetons are rock, right? Too high up and nothing covering them. And that's similar as we're seeing this. Some of that with mountain ranges has to do with moisture and how much or little you get truly impacts the types of growth that we might see. We can see some of that right here in the valley. You can look at the mountain ranges and see some hints of vegetation, and we can see quite a bit that look pretty devoid. It depends on which side of the mountain you're looking at, right? As far as how much moisture you might potentially be getting. And we'll hit some of that here in a second as we think about like desert-like regions and some of the potentials for how water is moving around to kind of stimulate some of those situations. And we definitely can see some of that here as well. So tundra-like environments, we've got low-growing plants, shrubs, this shrub willow, not willow trees. They dominate these types of landscapes, and they grow for a very short period of time, right? Oftentimes we think of, around here, months of growing potential from spring until late fall. We're still seeing some plants out there that are nice and green. It's getting cold and it's all starting to taper off here. In tundra-like regions, maybe a month and a half of growing season, maybe not quite that much, right? They don't have a huge amount of time to actually be productive, right? They also are in really pretty harsh environments, right? High winds, storms, things like that. The permafrost, the frozen ground, is also inhibitory to big woody trees putting roots down into that. They can't persist. So we see different vegetation like this that's able to persist. And with that, there's numerous animals that tap into these resources, like caribou, as an example. So we are moving into some aquatic stuff. So kind of just like the idea of the different types of biomes that we think about on land, there are differences when we think about aquatic environments as well. There's differences between freshwater and saltwater. There's differences between, there's all sorts of variation, differences between fast and slow moving rivers, set the stage for different types of organisms in those environments. There are big differences when we start thinking about coastal areas, and it's kind of the same idea. Where are you at? Are you close to equatorial regions? Are you close to, polar regions? The types of habitat that are potential are going to be varied. We also need to think about things like ocean currents. Just like the air moving moisture around on the planet, water currents move the water, and ultimately as the water is being cycled and churned around, these ocean currents help to move nutrients and help to provide food stuff for all sorts of organisms, right? So in intertidal zones, coastal regions, there are all sorts of possibilities where we could see some tremendous diversity. Sea stars and urchins, mussels may potentially call areas like this home. We talked a little bit back about some keystone species, and in aquatic, in ocean habitats like these intertidal zones, they play vital roles as keystone species, helping to hold things in check, like the sea urchin and the mussel, keeping all of these populations so that they're able to all survive together. And we have definitely seen in areas where sea star is removed or goes away, issues with urchins and mussels growing out of proportions are big problems. So the ocean is divided into some different zones as well, based off of the depth of the water and how far out to sea you are as well. So there are definitely some more potentials as we look up here, the intertidal zone, the Neretic zone, where we may see more diversity, more possibilities for variation. And as we move lower, deeper, that goes down. And definitely as we start looking over here in this abyssal zone, the potential for sunlight to make its way into the deep depths of the ocean are almost non-existent. And so thinking about photosynthetic organisms like plankton is an issue. That's more up here in the photic zone, where we've got ample amounts of solar energy. We also see more of that planktonic stuff near the coastal region. And as you get out into the deep ocean, not huge quantities of that, right? So more near the continental shelf and near this photic zone. It starts to decline as we drop into the aphotic zone with more light being not being able to make its way down here. And then again, as we get to the bottom bit, it's basically impossible to penetrate down this deep. Meters, 4,000 or so meters down. That's for the potential for sunlight to make its way in there, difficult. So oftentimes we think about, fishing within these types of regions. And as we get to the deeper bits, there are definitely organisms that we can find within here, but it's not exactly the same. And as far as diversity goes, it drops pretty dramatically. So reefs, coral reefs are formed, basically built on the shoulders of other corals that have died before them. The calcium carbonate skeletons of these corals, these are invertebrates, aquatic or marine invertebrates, the phylum Cnidaria. And we can see here part of a reef that has all sorts of variation, all sorts of diversity, and they harbor lots of life. There are some similarities to this, like thinking kind of tropical sorts of forests with a lot of variation. A coral reef typically has a lot of variation. There are some big issues with this as we think about stuff like climate change. And as temperatures increase on the planet, it also increases in water as well. And we see temperatures of the oceans going up, and that sets the stage for potential problems, right? There are situations with coral reefs, they call it coral bleaching. And it's kind of like the coral has an infection and then it gets a fever, right? And when you get a fever, you try to push out the bad guys, right? Corals, these invertebrates have some symbiotes that live inside of them, some algae. And these algae give the corals, when they're thriving, give them their colors that we can see. There are numerous types of algae that get in and colonize. And if the temperature gets too warm, kind of thinking like that algae could be a bad guy, but it's not, right? It ejects out its symbiote. It kicks out the algae, and the coral needs the algae to survive. So they start to bleach, they start to whiten. They are in the process of dying because their symbiote is no longer with them. There are potentials, if the temperatures decrease a little bit, that they can recolonize and the algae comes back. But the question truly is, how long can these corals be bleached and persist? We don't know that yet, right? We are in the process of watching numerous coral reefs being kind of graveyards. And once this happens and they lose their symbiotes and they basically look like these skeletons, all of the other organisms that once said this is a nice place to live, they go away as well, right? So big impacts as we think about some of that and trying to maintain the reef in its healthy status is definitely important, right? So here, what we're looking at is an estuary. An estuary is a region where the saltwater and freshwater merge, where the rivers dump into the oceans, right? And there are numerous potentials in these situations where the freshwater is bringing nutrients. Those nutrients provide ample resources for stuff like plankton to grow. And there are different types. The phytoplankton, the photosynthetic ones, zooplankton are like little aquatic invertebrates or larval stages. They might be feeding on the plankton, so they could be like the first consumers. And then fish feeding on either plankton or zooplankton, tapping into that, right? So in an estuary, lots of resources, lots of nutrients for the diversity, and it provides great habitat for fish and other aquatic animals in these mixing zones where we see the fresh and salt water combining. There's also, last time we showed areas where we see dead zones, where these rivers are bringing mass quantities of sediment and nutrients that are in excess, that sets the stage for huge algal growth and the destruction of these types of habitat. And it is definitely of great concern to protect these types of habitat. And in some situations, it could be the restoration or reintroduction of wetlands into areas like this that help to provide a buffering capacity so that the estuary doesn't get destroyed. So here is an example of some of that with uncontrolled algal growth. We can see mass quantities. It kind of reminds me of like a fish tank that's not kept up very well. We were terrible fish owners. We had a goldfish that had an aquarium that it oftentimes got lots of algae on the sides. He kind of seemed like he kind of liked it. I would see him eating stuff like that. I don't know, right? Deep down, probably not the best. So these situations we can think about here, in an urban sort of environment, lots of runoff, bringing fertilizers into the waterways and lending to these big algal blooms, right? I talked with a person that was working at a golf course, working on the grounds, right? And she was dealing with all of the plants, all of this stuff on a golf course. You technically like to see stuff growing. You want the grass to be nice, and you'd like to have other stuff growing as well. You would like it to look nice, I suppose. Golf courses are kind of big issues when we think about water consumption and potential runoff and things like that with eutrophication, with stuff like this. Her concern were all of these little ponds, all of these water features around the golf course. They're doing this, getting full of algae, getting completely overgrown, and kind of an eyesore. Doesn't really look very good, right? And she questioned, what could we do to prevent some of these issues? How could we make our little ponds look better? And my first thought to her was, you're using too much fertilizer, right? You should think about that. Backing that off could potentially solve all of these problems. But then you need to step back and you're like, well, but we've got to keep the grass green. How do we do that without dumping on all this fertilizer? It's kind of a double-edged sword. How do you deal with that stuff, right? I think the ponds are still full of algae, right? I'm pretty sure that's what's happening. My question was, could you just back it off right around that, and then a little bit of it's not being fertilized, but the rest of it was? Maybe that could be effective. That's also difficult, especially if it's broad application being sprayed out. Hard to kind of control that, I suppose. I think you could. So there are definitely, and I mentioned this before we looked at the differences between them. Rivers might be fast flowing, maybe shallow, or deep and slow moving, and the potentials for things to thrive or maybe not are definitely buried in the differing types of habitats. There are also potentials as we look at this river with all of the cover, lots of leaves on both sides of the bank. And in some instances, potentially, it looks like fall here, but in the middle of the summer, there'd be a lot of shade covering the majority of this, and a lot of nutrients being put into the water from this vegetation that provides food stuff for lots of aquatic invertebrates. As we look at this river, there's vegetation on the banks, but there's a big wide open area that's different than we see over here. And the potential for what either of these may be able to maintain is different, right? And the type of aquatic invertebrates sets the stage for different types of fish to potentially thrive or not, right? And so all of these things are factors that potentially influence these regions. And we also can think about areas where there is more exposure for greater amounts of evaporation as well. That's a different story. I think these trees are pretty impressive, and a bunch of these little things growing on here. These plants, I can't remember what they're called. I should have taken a quick trip to the greenhouse in the biology department because we got some of these growing. These types of plants are called epiphytes. They grow on something else. They're growing on these trees. They have aerial roots that are absorbing nutrients and moisture. They're not tapped into the water, and they're not sucking nutrients out of the tree. They're just using them as a place to basically take hold, right? And grow. Kind of cool. So this wetland environment in the Everglades is full of all sorts of different types of trees. Mangrove forests, these are cypress, I think. The mangroves kind of similar looking like this with big roots that go down, and it's kind of brackish, salty, freshwater mixing. Yes? Can these grow on buildings? That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would think they probably could grow on whatever they could take hold to. I would think, but I'm not sure. So there is one in the greenhouse. There is one mangrove tree with these crazy roots. Some of them almost look like toes going down as they hit the ground. These big roots, kind of aerial roots as well, that would reach out. The tree itself no longer is alive in the greenhouse for one reason, who knows? But it's like this, it was big, and it's kind of like this big scaffolding where other things were using it to grow. And there were these on there, there were other plants kind of intertwined within it. So they've left all of it. I don't see them anywhere else. They haven't moved them around. It's all on that one mangrove. So I'm not 100%, but I will see if the person in the greenhouse is there today, and I'll ask her about that. It's pretty crazy to think about some of these that I feel like they, as long as they've got something to take hold on, they would grow. But so these types of wetlands have the potential to harbor all sorts of diversity. And with that, they also, and I mentioned this last time, we think about them trapping some of these nutrients and sediments as the rivers are flowing into the ocean. A wetland helps to provide this barrier and filtering mechanism before that happens. Hopefully minimizing the eutrophication that we looked at a second ago. And that's the end. There we go. I thought for sure we should have another. If you guys would like the handful that are in here, I can take you into the greenhouse in the biology building for a quick field trip if you would like to see a couple of different things. I can probably tell you there's going to be some lemons in there about that big. That's pretty impressive. There are all sorts of different things from desert-like. It's almost like all of the biomes in this building. We've got desert-like, tropical-like, and semi-tropical rooms that full of cactus, and others you may think, I just went into the jungle. So if you're interested, we can do that. If you're tuning in from home, you better come to class sometime. You also, if you do find your way in the biology building and that greenhouse door is open, you are welcome to pop in there whenever. So she will gladly give you a tour. All right, guys, have a great break.